In the frozen halls of the Dreadfort, where flayed men hang as banners and screams echo through stone corridors, there once lived a lord who whispered death, while others shouted war. Roose Bolton, the Leech Lord, a man whose pale eyes held secrets darker than the deepest winter night. His voice, soft as silk yet sharp as a flaying knife, could chill the blood of the bravest knights with nothing more than a gentle suggestion. Picture, if you will, a great hall filled with the most powerful lords of Westeros, celebrating what they believe to be a joyous wedding feast. Laughter fills the air, wine flows freely, and musicians play their merry tunes. But in the shadows, watching with calculating eyes, sits a man who has orchestrated the most shocking betrayal in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. A man who built his power not through roaring courage or flashy displays of strength, but through patience, cunning, and the quiet art of survival. The musicians stop playing, the hall falls silent, and in that moment of terrible stillness, 3 words change the course of history forever. 3 words that seal the fate of kings and kingdoms. 3 words spoken in a voice so calm, so controlled, that they seem almost gentle. But these words carry the weight of 1,000 corpses, the echo of broken oaths, and the cold promise of a new order built on bones and blood. But this is not where our story begins, nor where it ends. For the tale of Roose Bolton stretches far beyond that crimson night at the Twins. It begins in the ancient halls of the Dreadfort, where a young lord learned that survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead of every enemy, every friend, every son. It is the story of a man who played the game of thrones so masterfully that he forgot the most dangerous opponent of all was sleeping under his own roof. How did the quiet lord of an ancient house rise to become Warden of the North? What drove him to commit the most infamous act of treachery in Westerosi history? And why did his own flesh and blood become his ultimate downfall? These questions will unfold like layers of ice melting to reveal the dark truths beneath. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the chilling tale of Roose Bolton, the Leech Lord, whose quiet ambition carved through the North like a blade through silk. A man who understood that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are those who never raise their voices, never draw attention, never make the mistake of seeming threatening until it is far too late. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Dreadfort stands like a dark sentinel in the northern reaches of Westeros, its triangular towers rising from the banks of the weeping water like ancient stone fangs. For thousands of years, this fortress has been home to House Bolton, a family whose very name sends shivers through the spine of every man, woman, and child in the north. The castle walls, built from dark grey stone that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, have witnessed centuries of unspeakable horrors, each generation of Boltons adding their own chapter to a legacy written in blood and suffering. The Bolton sigil tells you everything you need to know about this ancient house. A flayed man hangs upside down against a field of red, his skin peeled away to reveal the raw flesh beneath. It is not merely a symbol but a promise, a reminder of what happens to those who cross the lords of the Dreadfort. Their house words, simple yet chilling, echo through the halls like a whispered threat. Our blades are sharp, not an boast of martial prowess but a guarantee of precision, of methodical cruelty, of death delivered with surgical accuracy. Within these forbidding walls, the practice of flaying has been perfected over generations. The Boltons do not kill in the heat of passion or the chaos of battle. They kill slowly, deliberately, artistically. The dungeons beneath the Dreadfort contain instruments of torture that would make hardened soldiers weep, and the knowledge of how to use them is passed down from father to son like a sacred tradition. The screams that echo from those depths serve as both entertainment and education, teaching young Boltons that power comes not from the quick death of a sword, but from the slow mastery of fear. Into this world of calculated cruelty was born Roose Bolton, a child who learned before he could properly walk that survival meant understanding when to strike and when to wait. Unlike his ancestors, who often let their bloodlust make them reckless, young Roose possessed something far more dangerous: patience. His pale eyes, the color of winter ice, missed nothing. His voice, even as a boy, carried a quality that made grown men uneasy. Where other children played with wooden swords and dreamed of glorious battles, Roose studied ledgers, maps, and the subtle art of reading human nature. As he grew to manhood, Roose married Bethany Risewell, a match that brought political advantages and produced a son who seemed to embody everything the Bolton name could become when tempered with honor. Demeric Bolton was everything a lord could want in an heir: intelligent, brave, well-educated, and surprisingly kind for a child raised in the shadow of the flaying post. He learned to ride from the best masters, studied with learned septons, and even spent time in the Vale learning the ways of knighthood and chivalry. But the Dreadfort holds many secrets in its shadowy corners, and not all of them wear the Bolton name with pride. In the villages surrounding the castle, whispered stories tell of a miller's wife who caught the attention of the young Lord Bolton, not with her beauty or her charm, but with her defiance. The story goes that she married without his lordship's permission, an act that demanded correction. What happened in that mill on that dark night became the stuff of hushed conversations and nervous glances. Some say it was justice, others call it what it truly was: rape. From that violent union came a bastard son, born with his father's pale eyes, but none of his restraint. Ramsay Snow, as he was known before legitimacy, blessed his name, grew up wild and cruel in ways that made even the Boltons take notice. Where Roose was calculating, Ramsay was impulsive. Where Roose was patient, Ramsay was eager. Where Roose killed when necessary, Ramsay killed because he could. The contrast between the two Bolton sons could not have been more stark. Demeric, the true-born heir, represented the possibility of a more honorable future for House Bolton. He was beloved by the small folk, respected by the nobles, and seemed destined to transform his family's dark legacy into something approaching respectability. Ramsay, the bastard, embodied every nightmare story ever told about the Dreadfort. His cruelty was legendary even as a child, his appetite for suffering insatiable, his loyalty questionable at best. For years these two worlds existed separately within the walls of the Dreadfort. Roose Bolton, the calculating lord, managing his lands with careful precision and building relationships that would serve him well in times of war and peace. Demeric Bolton, the noble son training to become the kind of lord the North could respect, even admire. And in the shadows, growing stronger and more dangerous with each passing season, Ramsay Snow, whose very existence was a reminder that even the most careful plans can be undone by a single moment of violence. The North itself seemed to reflect this duality. Ancient and honorable, ruled by the Starks of Winterfell, with their unwavering sense of justice and duty, yet harboring in its frozen depths families like the Boltons, whose loyalty ran only as deep as their immediate advantage. The political landscape was a delicate balance of old alliances, bitter grudges, and carefully maintained treaties that could shatter at the first sign of weakness. But change was coming to the North, carried on winds that would soon howl with the sound of war horns and dying men. The transition from boy to lord came early for Roose Bolton, as it did for many in the unforgiving North. When his father passed, leaving behind only whispered warnings and a reputation that cast long shadows across the Dreadfort, young Roose inherited more than just lands and titles. He inherited a legacy of fear that stretched back thousands of years, and with it the weight of expectations that would have crushed a lesser man. Unlike many young lords who celebrated their newfound power with feasts and tournaments, Roose approached his inheritance with the methodical precision of a maester studying ancient texts. He spent his first months as Lord Bolton reviewing every ledger, every treaty, every debt owed, and every favor granted. His stewards, initially expecting the typical arrogance of youth, found themselves facing a lord who knew more about their work than they did themselves. Roose had learned something that many nobles never grasped. Knowledge was power, but applied knowledge was dominance. The North in those days was a different place than it would become during the wars that followed. The Stark banners flew proudly over Winterfell, and Rickard Stark ruled with the kind of steady hand that made even rebellious houses think twice before challenging his authority. Yet beneath this surface stability, currents of change were already flowing. Southern politics were seeping northward like poison in a well, bringing with them ideas about power and ambition that had little place in the harsh realities of northern survival. Roose watched these changes with the patient attention of a hunter observing prey. While other lords concerned themselves with immediate gains and petty rivalries, he studied the broader patterns. When Rickard Stark began forging alliances through marriage, connecting northern houses to southern power, Roose understood that the old ways were ending. The North would not remain isolated forever, and when the time came for choosing sides, survival would depend on reading the currents correctly. His own marriage to Bethany Ricewell exemplified this calculating approach. House Ricewell controlled lands that bordered Bolton territory, and their alliance strengthened Roose's position while providing him with a wife whose family understood the harsh realities of northern politics. Bethany was not a romantic choice, but she was a practical one, and their union produced the stability that allowed Roose to consolidate his power without the distractions of internal conflict. When Bethany gave birth to Demeric, Roose experienced something he had not expected: genuine affection for another human being. The boy represented everything Roose had hoped for in an heir. Intelligent without being bookish, strong without being reckless, kind without being weak. Demeric seemed to embody the possibility that House Bolton could evolve beyond its dark reputation, while maintaining the strength that had kept them alive for centuries. But fate, as Roose would learn repeatedly throughout his life, had little interest in his careful plans. Bethany's death came suddenly, striking down a woman who had seemed as permanent and reliable as the stones of the Dreadfort itself. The official cause was fever, but Roose knew better than most that death in the North rarely announced itself with convenient explanations. Whether through illness, accident, or something more sinister, Bethany was gone, leaving behind a grieving husband and a young son who would now grow up without a mother's softening influence. The loss changed something fundamental in Roose's approach to the world. Where he had once believed that careful planning could protect what mattered most, he now understood that chaos could destroy the best-laid schemes in a single night. This realization did not make him reckless, but it did make him more ruthless. If the world was fundamentally unpredictable, then survival required being prepared for any possibility, no matter how brutal. His brief second marriage lasted barely 2 years, ended by another sudden death that left the servants of the Dreadfort whispering behind closed doors. Some said the Bolton curse claimed any woman who tried to bring warmth to those cold halls. Others suggested that Lord Roose had simply grown tired of sharing his authority. The truth, as with so many things about Roose Bolton, remained locked away behind pale eyes that revealed nothing. When the ravens began arriving in the north, carrying news of rebellion in the south, Roose read them with the same careful attention he gave to crop reports and tax assessments. Robert Baratheon had declared war against King Aerys Targaryen, claiming the Iron Throne for himself with the backing of House Stark and House Arryn. The realm was fracturing along lines of loyalty and ambition, and every lord would soon be forced to choose a side. For many northern lords, the choice was simple. Rickard Stark had called his banners, and northern honor demanded they answer. But Roose approached the decision with characteristic calculation. Robert's cause had merit. The Targaryen dynasty was clearly failing, and most importantly, backing the losing side in a civil war was a luxury House Bolton could not afford. When the call came to march south, Roose assembled his men with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. The army that marched from the Dreadfort was smaller than what some greater houses could muster, but it was disciplined in ways that would prove valuable in the campaigns ahead. Roose had learned from studying the histories of past wars that battles were won not by the boldest charges or the most dramatic gestures, but by units that maintained formation, followed orders, and adapted to changing circumstances without losing their nerve. At the Trident, where Robert Baratheon shattered Rhaegar Targaryen's army and effectively ended the Targaryen dynasty, Roose commanded the Bolton forces with quiet competence that earned respect from allies and enemies alike. He did not seek glory or recognition, understanding that survival often depended on being noticed for competence rather than heroism. When Prince Rhaegar fell beneath Robert's hammer, Roose was among the first to understand that the war was truly over, even though fighting would continue for months. The relationship he forged with Ned Stark during those campaigns would shape northern politics for the next 15 years. Ned, now Lord of Winterfell following his father's death, represented everything Roose both respected and found naive about northern nobility. Honor, duty, justice, all admirable qualities that Roose had learned could become fatal weaknesses when applied without flexibility. Yet Ned's unwavering moral compass provided stability that benefited everyone, including lords who privately questioned whether such rigid principles could survive in a world where survival often required compromise. When the armies returned north, Roose brought with him not just the satisfaction of backing the winning side, but also valuable lessons about southern politics and warfare that would serve him well in years to come. He had seen how quickly established orders could crumble, how easily loyalty could be bought or broken, and how those who adapted fastest to changing circumstances were most likely to survive and prosper. The North welcomed its returning heroes with celebrations and relief, but Roose understood that the real work was just beginning. The rebellion had ended one era and begun another, and the lords who thrived in this new world would be those who learned its rules fastest and applied them most effectively. As he rode through the gates of the Dreadfort, past the flayed man banners that had flown there for 1,000 years, Roose Bolton began planning for a future that would test every lesson he had learned about power, loyalty, and survival. The years following Robert's rebellion brought a deceptive peace to the north, the kind of quiet that allowed old grudges to fester and new ambitions to take root. In the Dreadfort, Lord Roose Bolton settled into the rhythm of ruling his lands with the same methodical precision he had brought to warfare. But peace, as he would discover, carried its own dangers, particularly for a man whose reputation was built on the premise that his blades were always sharp. It was during one of his routine inspections of Bolton lands that fate intervened in the most mundane possible way. A miller had married without seeking his lord's permission, a small act of defiance that most lords might have addressed with a fine or a few days in the stocks. But Roose Bolton was not most lords, and the slight, however minor, demanded correction. What happened that night in the mill beside the Weeping Water would echo through the halls of the Dreadfort for decades to come. The miller's wife was not remarkable for her beauty or her charm, but for her defiance. Even as Roose explained the nature of her offense, even as her husband cowered in the corner, understanding exactly what was about to happen, she maintained a stubborn dignity that both impressed and irritated the Lord of the Dreadfort. Perhaps in a different time, or with a different lord, her courage might have earned mercy. Instead, it ensured that the lesson would be particularly memorable. Roose took what he considered his due, with the same dispassionate efficiency he brought to all his duties. The miller hung from a tree before dawn, his wife's cries echoing across the water as she was left to contemplate the price of defiance. What Roose did not anticipate was that this act of casual brutality would produce consequences extending far beyond the intended lesson about lordly authority. 9 months later, a bastard son entered the world in circumstances that would have been unremarkable if not for the pale eyes he inherited from his father. Ramsay Snow, as he came to be known, was raised by his mother in the shadow of his father's crime, fed on stories of lordship and power that seemed as distant as the stars, yet those pale eyes so distinctive among the Boltons marked him as something more than just another bastard struggling for survival in the harsh northern landscape. For years Roose remained unaware of his son's existence, focused instead on raising Demeric with the careful attention befitting a true-born heir. Demeric grew into everything a lord could want: intelligent, well-educated, physically capable, and possessed of a natural kindness that seemed to soften some of the harsher edges of the Bolton reputation. Under the tutelage of maesters and master-at-arms, he learned not just the skills of warfare and governance, but also music, reading, and the subtle arts of diplomacy that would serve him well as Lord of the Dreadfort. The contrast between the two boys, though neither yet knew of the other's existence, could not have been more striking. Where Demeric learned to channel his strength into productive pursuits, Ramsay, growing up wild in the villages around the Dreadfort, developed appetites that disturbed even the hardened small folk who had learned to accept the Boltons' darker traditions. Stories began to circulate about the bastard boy who tortured animals for pleasure, who seemed to take genuine delight in the suffering of others, who displayed a cruelty that went beyond anything required for survival or dominance. When Ramsay finally appeared at the gates of the Dreadfort, claiming his birthright as a Bolton bastard, Roose faced a dilemma that would have challenged even the most experienced lord. The boy bore the unmistakable signs of Bolton blood, those pale eyes that marked him as clearly as any seal or signature. Yet acknowledging him would mean accepting responsibility for his actions, both past and future, while rejecting him might create an enemy whose intimate knowledge of Bolton's secrets could prove dangerous. Roose's decision to acknowledge Ramsay was typically practical. A bastard under his control was less dangerous than a bastard operating independently, and the boy's obvious intelligence, however twisted, might prove useful if properly directed. What Roose did not fully appreciate was that some forms of cruelty could not be controlled or directed, only unleashed. The dynamic that developed between Demeric and Ramsay was complex and ultimately tragic. Demeric, raised with a nobleman's sense of duty and family loyalty, genuinely tried to include his bastard half-brother in the life of the Dreadfort. He taught Ramsay to read, shared his own education, and attempted to provide the guidance that might have shaped a different kind of man. For a time it seemed as though Demeric's influence might succeed where others had failed. But Ramsay had learned different lessons during his formative years. He had learned that power came from inspiring fear, that weakness was something to be exploited rather than protected, and that family bonds were simply another tool to be used for advantage. When he looked at his true-born brother, he saw not a mentor or protector, but an obstacle standing between him and what he considered his rightful inheritance. Demeric's death came suddenly, and without clear explanation. The official cause was a fever, the same convenient diagnosis that had claimed Roose's wives, but the timing, coming so soon after Ramsay's integration into the household, raised questions that Roose was intelligent enough to ask, even if he chose not to pursue the answers too aggressively. The loss of his heir was devastating, but the suspicion that his bastard son might be responsible was almost too terrible to contemplate. Yet contemplate it he did, in the privacy of his chambers, where even the servants dared not intrude. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Ramsay had motive, opportunity, and a demonstrated lack of moral restraint. More importantly, he had shown no grief at his brother's death, only a poorly concealed satisfaction that suggested guilt more clearly than any confession. The decision to keep Ramsay close rather than banish or execute him was perhaps the most fateful choice Roose Bolton ever made. He told himself it was practical, that a known threat was easier to manage than an unknown one, but there was more to it than simple calculation. In Ramsay's ruthless ambition and complete lack of moral constraints, Roose recognized something of himself, albeit taken to extremes that even he found disturbing. During these same years, Roose was also managing the broader political landscape of the North, with his characteristic attention to detail. The marriage alliance with House Frey, formalized through his union with Fat Walder Frey, provided both personal satisfaction and strategic advantage. Walder's dowry was substantial, her family's connections valuable, and her pleasant demeanor a welcome change from the tensions that had surrounded his previous marriages. The relationship between Roose and his new wife was surprisingly cordial, based more on mutual respect and practical cooperation than passion, but functional in ways that benefited both parties. Walder understood her role as Lady Bolton and performed it competently, while Roose provided the protection and status that her marriage had been designed to secure. As the years passed, and peace continued to reign in the Seven Kingdoms, Roose found himself in the enviable position of a lord whose careful management had strengthened his house's position without the risks that came with dramatic gestures or ambitious overreach. His lands were prosperous, his alliances secure, and his reputation for competence and reliability well established among his peers. But beneath this surface stability, darker currents were flowing. Ramsay was growing stronger and more confident, his appetites becoming harder to satisfy through conventional means. The small folk whispered stories that grew more disturbing with each telling, and even some of Roose's own men began to express concerns about the bastard's increasingly erratic behavior. The stage was being set for conflicts that would test everything Roose had built during his years of careful planning and methodical construction of power. The peaceful interlude was ending, though few could have predicted how dramatically the world was about to change. The raven that arrived at the Dreadfort on that grey morning in 298 AC carried news that would shatter the peace. Roose Bolton had spent years carefully cultivating. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, was dead. Not fallen in battle defending his lands, not claimed by age or illness as might befit a man of his years, but executed as a traitor in the shadow of the great sept of Baelor, his head separated from his shoulders by ice, the ancient Valyrian steel greatsword of his own house. The news hit the North like a physical blow, rippling outward from Winterfell through every holdfast and hamlet, until even the smallest villages knew that their world had fundamentally changed. But nowhere did the implications register more clearly than in the calculating mind of Roose Bolton, who understood immediately that Ned Stark's death was not an ending but a beginning. The careful balance that had maintained peace in the Seven Kingdoms for nearly 15 years was about to collapse, and in the chaos that followed, those who adapted fastest would survive, while those who clung to old certainties would perish. Young Robb Stark's response was as predictable as it was admirable. The boy, barely 16 and thrust into lordship under the worst possible circumstances, called his banners with all the righteous fury of youth and the moral certainty inherited from his father. The North would march south, not for conquest or glory, but for justice. They would rescue Sansa and Arya Stark from the clutches of the Lannisters, punish those responsible for Eddard's death, and restore honor to a realm that had seemingly forgotten its meaning. For most northern lords, the choice was simple. The Starks had ruled them for thousands of years, earning loyalty through consistent leadership and shared sacrifice. When Winterfell called, the North answered, as it always had and always would. But Roose Bolton was not most lords, and his response to Robb's summons was filtered through layers of calculation that went far beyond simple feudal obligation. The military situation, as Roose analyzed it in the privacy of his solar, was complex but not hopeless. The North could field a substantial army, perhaps 20,000 men, if every house answered the call, and northern soldiers were among the finest in the realm when fighting on familiar ground. but they would be marching into the heart of enemy territory, far from their supply lines and support, facing armies that outnumbered them and treasury resources they could not hope to match. More troubling was the political landscape surrounding the conflict. This was not a simple war between North and South, but a multi-sided struggle that already showed signs of fracturing into chaos. Stannis Baratheon was pressing his claim to the Iron Throne based on his brother's alleged lack of legitimate heirs. Renly Baratheon was doing the same, backed by the wealth of the Reach and the strength of the Stormlands. In the Iron Islands, Balon Greyjoy was stirring, no doubt planning to exploit the mainland's distraction for his own advantage. And somewhere in Essos, the last Targaryens were reportedly gathering strength for their own attempt to reclaim their ancestral throne. Yet despite these complexities, Roose understood that neutrality was not an option. In conflicts of this magnitude, those who tried to remain uncommitted typically found themselves crushed by whichever side eventually emerged victorious. The question was not whether to fight, but which side offered the best chance of survival and advancement for House Bolton. His decision to support Robb Stark was based on practical considerations rather than sentiment. The North was his home, and his power base was built on relationships with other northern houses that would be jeopardized by any appearance of disloyalty. Moreover, young Stark showed genuine potential as a military commander, and his cause had the kind of moral clarity that could inspire men to fight beyond their normal capabilities. The army that marched from the Dreadfort reflected Roose's approach to warfare. His men were well equipped, disciplined, and led by officers who understood that battles were won through coordination and tactical flexibility rather than individual heroics. Among them rode Ramsay Snow, now legitimized as Ramsay Bolton, whose reputation for cruelty had already begun to spread beyond the borders of their lands. The early stages of the campaign validated Roose's cautious optimism about their chances. Robb Stark proved to be an intuitive military commander whose youth was balanced by advisors like the Blackfish and his mother Catelyn. The victory at the Battle of the Whispering Wood, where they captured Jaime Lannister himself, demonstrated that northern steel could match southern gold when properly applied. But it was at the Battle of the Green Fork that Roose first began to question whether Robb's strategy was sustainable in the long term. The plan called for splitting their forces, with Robb leading the main army against Jaime, while a smaller force under Roose would engage Tywin Lannister's larger army in a holding action. It was a sound tactical concept that had the potential to catch their enemies off balance and destroy them piecemeal. However, Roose understood better than most that battles rarely unfold according to plan, and that commanders who survived long campaigns were those who prioritized the preservation of their own forces over abstract strategic objectives. When he faced Tywin's army on the Green Fork, he fought competently but not recklessly, maintaining formation and discipline while avoiding the kind of heroic charges that might have destroyed his forces for minimal strategic gain. The tactical withdrawal that followed was masterfully executed, preserving the majority of his men while inflicting casualties on Tywin's forces that were proportionally significant. But Roose was also acutely aware that he had not pressed his attack with the kind of desperate intensity that the strategic situation might have demanded. It was a decision that reflected his fundamental approach to warfare: survive first, achieve objectives second. The concerns that were already forming in Roose's mind about the long-term sustainability of their cause were reinforced by his observations of Robb's command style. The young king in the north, as he had been proclaimed by his bannerman, possessed natural military instincts and genuine courage. But he also displayed the kind of inflexibility that Roose recognized as characteristic of Stark honor. Robb made decisions based on what was right rather than what was practical, and while this inspired fierce loyalty among his followers, it also created vulnerabilities that experienced enemies could exploit. More troubling was the broader strategic picture that was emerging as the war continued. The Lannisters had deeper resources than anyone had initially calculated, and their alliances with houses like the Tyrells were shifting the balance of power in ways that made northern victory increasingly unlikely. Meanwhile, Stannis and Renly were tearing each other apart in the south, eliminating potential allies and ensuring that whoever emerged from their conflict would be weakened but still formidable. During the quiet moments between battles, when the camp settled into the routine of campaign life, Roose found himself studying maps and supply reports with growing unease. They were winning battles but losing the war, gaining tactical victories while their strategic position gradually deteriorated. The north was strong, but it was not inexhaustible, and every man lost was one that could not be easily replaced. It was during this period that the first tentative communications began arriving from unexpected sources, messages that spoke of mutual interests and shared concerns about the direction of the war. Messages that suggested there might be alternatives to fighting a conflict to its inevitable bitter conclusion. Messages that would eventually reshape the entire course of the war and determine the fate of everyone involved. But for now, those communications remained preliminary and indirect, mere hints of possibilities that might exist for lords wise enough to recognize when circumstances were changing and pragmatic enough to adapt accordingly. The months that followed the Green Fork revealed the true complexity of the war that had engulfed the Seven Kingdoms. What had begun as a straightforward conflict between the Starks and Lannisters was evolving into something far more intricate, a web of shifting alliances and competing ambitions that tested every lord's ability to navigate treacherous political waters. For Roose Bolton, these complications presented both dangers and opportunities that would require all his accumulated wisdom to handle properly. Robb Stark's war council had grown more sophisticated as the campaign progressed, reflecting both the young king's maturation as a commander and the practical necessities of managing a complex military operation. Roose found himself playing an increasingly important role in these discussions, his voice carrying weight that reflected both his military competence and his reputation for sound judgment. Where other lords might offer advice colored by personal ambition or regional prejudices, Roose provided analysis that seemed purely objective, focused on tactical realities rather than political considerations. This growing influence was not accidental. Roose had recognized early that Robb, despite his natural military instincts, lacked the kind of experienced advisors who could help him navigate the complexities of prolonged warfare. The Blackfish was competent but limited in scope. Catelyn Stark was intelligent but handicapped by her emotional investment in the outcome, and most of the other bannermen were better suited to following orders than developing strategy. Into this vacuum, Roose inserted himself with characteristic subtlety, offering guidance that was genuinely valuable while positioning himself as indispensable to the Northern cause. The advice he provided was carefully calculated to serve multiple purposes. On the surface, his recommendations were designed to advance Robb's military objectives and strengthen the Northern position. But beneath this obvious layer, Roose was also ensuring that his own forces remained as intact as possible while other houses bore the heaviest casualties. When planning assaults, he volunteered for tasks that were important but not suicidal. When distributing supplies, he made certain that Bolton forces received adequate provisions. When assigning garrison duties, he positioned his men in locations that were strategically valuable but relatively secure. These maneuvers were executed with such skill that they appeared to be motivated purely by military necessity rather than personal advantage. Roose had learned long ago that the most effective manipulation was that which remained invisible to those being manipulated. His fellow lords saw a competent commander making sound tactical decisions, while Robb saw a loyal bannerman whose advice consistently proved valuable. Neither group recognized that they were watching a master craftsman at work, carefully shaping events to serve his own long-term interests. The first direct communication from Tywin Lannister arrived through channels so discreet that even Roose's most trusted servants remained unaware of its existence. The message was brief, coded in language that could be interpreted as innocent correspondence if intercepted, but its meaning was unmistakable to someone with Roose's political sophistication. The old lion was exploring possibilities, testing whether certain northern lords might be amenable to discussions about alternative arrangements that could benefit all parties involved. Roose's response was equally subtle, neither accepting nor rejecting the overture, but indicating a willingness to listen should more concrete proposals emerge. It was a delicate balance that required him to leave options open while avoiding any commitments that might prove disadvantageous if circumstances changed. The art of such negotiations lay not in what was said explicitly, but in what was implied through careful word choice and strategic omissions. Meanwhile, the war itself was developing in ways that validated Roose's growing concerns about the Northern cause's long-term prospects. Renly Baratheon's death had eliminated one rival claimant but strengthened Stannis considerably, creating a more formidable opponent for the Lannisters while doing nothing to improve the North's strategic position. The alliance between Tywin and the Tyrells, formalized through Joffrey's betrothal to Margaery Tyrell, had shifted the balance of power dramatically in favor of the Iron Throne. Most troubling of all, Balon Greyjoy had finally made his move, launching attacks against the northern coast that forced Robb to divide his attention and resources. The fall of Winterfell to Theon Greyjoy represented a psychological blow that went far beyond its immediate military significance. The ancient seat of House Stark, the symbol of northern power and independence, had been taken by a ward who had been raised as a son. The news struck the northern army like a physical blow, undermining morale and raising questions about the security of their own homes and families. For Roose, however, Theon's betrayal provided an unexpected opportunity. While other lords focused on the emotional impact of losing Winterfell, he saw a chance to demonstrate Bolton loyalty and competence in a way that would strengthen his position with Robb while advancing his own interests. The recapture of the North's most important stronghold would require careful planning and substantial resources, but success would bring rewards that extended far beyond simple military advantage. Ramsay's role in the Winterfell operation reflected both his growing importance within Bolton forces and his father's increasing confidence in his abilities. The bastard had proven himself capable of the kind of ruthless efficiency that such missions required, and his reputation for creative cruelty might prove useful in dealing with Ironborn who were far from home and increasingly desperate as their position became untenable. The negotiations with Tywin continued to evolve, growing more specific as both parties tested each other's commitment and reliability. These discussions required Roose to walk an increasingly narrow line between maintaining his cover as a loyal Stark bannerman and exploring possibilities that might offer better long-term prospects for House Bolton. Each message exchanged brought him closer to a point where continued neutrality would become impossible, yet premature commitment might prove equally dangerous if circumstances shifted unexpectedly. The complexity of these calculations was compounded by the need to manage his relationship with Robb, whose trust had become both an asset and a liability. The young king's confidence in Roose's loyalty provided opportunities for influence and information that would be valuable regardless of how the broader conflict ultimately resolved. But that same trust also created moral obligations that conflicted with the practical necessities of ensuring Bolton's survival in a world where loyalty was becoming an increasingly expensive luxury. During the quiet hours between battles and councils, Roose found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him to this moment. The choices he was contemplating would have seemed unthinkable years earlier, when the world was more stable and the consequences of political decisions were less immediate and dramatic. But war had a way of clarifying priorities and forcing men to confront fundamental questions about survival and principle that could be avoided during times of peace. The letters from Fat Walder provided a welcome respite from these darker contemplations. Her correspondence was filled with domestic news and gentle humor that reminded him of the life he was fighting to preserve. She was pregnant again, a development that brought both joy and additional pressure to make decisions that would ensure his family's security, regardless of which faction ultimately emerged victorious. As winter approached and the campaign season drew to a close, Roose found himself positioned at the center of multiple overlapping conspiracies and conflicting loyalties. His public role as one of Robb's most trusted advisors continued to provide influence and information, while his private communications with Tywin Lannister offered possibilities for arrangements that might transcend the simple victory or defeat that seemed to be the only options most participants could envision. The stage was being set for decisions that would determine not only the fate of individual houses and kingdoms, but the very nature of power and loyalty in a world where ancient certainties were crumbling and new realities were being forged in blood and betrayal. The transformation of tentative negotiations into concrete conspiracy required a delicacy that few men possessed, and fewer still could execute without detection. By the winter of 299 AC, Roose Bolton had become a master of this dangerous art, weaving together threads of communication that connected the Dreadfort to Casterly Rock, while maintaining the appearance of unwavering loyalty to the king in the north. The complexity of managing these dual allegiances would have overwhelmed a lesser man, but Roose had spent his entire life preparing for moments when survival depended on reading situations correctly and acting decisively. Tywin Lannister's proposition, when it finally arrived in its complete form, was both audacious and meticulously planned. The old lion understood that military victory alone would not be sufficient to end the Northern Rebellion. Robb Stark had proven too capable a commander, and his cause had inspired too much genuine loyalty for conventional conquest to succeed without prohibitive costs. What was needed was a stroke that would decapitate the rebellion while demonstrating to potential future rebels the futility of challenging Lannister power. The plan centered around exploiting one of the few weaknesses in Robb's otherwise sound strategic approach. The young king's decision to marry Jenny Westerling, while understandable from an emotional perspective, had created a diplomatic crisis that threatened his alliance with House Frey. Walder Frey's wounded pride over the broken betrothal represented an opportunity that could be transformed into the weapon needed to end the war decisively. For Roose, the decision to participate in what would become known as the Red Wedding required balancing multiple considerations that went far beyond simple military strategy. The moral implications were significant, involving not just the betrayal of oaths sworn in good faith, but the murder of a king who had trusted him completely. Yet the practical realities were equally compelling. The Northern cause was failing despite its tactical successes, and continued loyalty would likely result in the destruction of House Bolton along with House Stark. The negotiations with both Tywin and Walder Frey required Roose to navigate competing demands and conflicting timelines while maintaining absolute secrecy about his true intentions. Each party needed assurances about the other's commitment and capability, yet too much detailed communication risked exposure that would destroy the entire enterprise. The logistics alone were staggering, involving the coordination of multiple armies and the management of countless variables that could not be completely controlled. Walder Frey's motivations were easier to understand than to stomach. The ancient lord's resentment over perceived slights stretched back decades, and his anger over Robb's broken promise had transformed wounded pride into genuine hatred. But Frey was also practical enough to recognize that his grievances alone would not be sufficient to justify the risks involved in such a massive betrayal. The promises of reward and protection from Tywin provided the practical incentives needed to transform resentment into action. The choice of Edmure Tully's wedding to Rosalind Frey as the setting for their conspiracy was inspired in its simplicity. Wedding feasts were occasions when traditional enmities were set aside, and guest right created an atmosphere of enforced peace that would lower everyone's guard. The presence of multiple high-value targets in a controlled environment would maximize the impact while minimizing the risk of key figures escaping to rally resistance. Roose's role in the final preparations required him to continue performing as Robb's loyal bannerman while secretly coordinating with his fellow conspirators. This dual existence created psychological pressures that might have broken a man less accustomed to compartmentalizing his thoughts and emotions. Every conversation with Robb, every planning session with the Northern War Council, every moment of apparent camaraderie had to be carefully managed to avoid betraying the terrible knowledge of what was to come. The journey to the twins provided the final opportunity for second thoughts and last-minute changes of heart. As the Northern Army made its way toward what they believed would be a celebration of renewed alliance, Roose found himself observing his companions with the detached curiosity of a man who knew he was watching the final acts of their lives. Robb's obvious happiness at the prospect of reconciliation with the Freys was particularly difficult to witness, representing as it did the kind of trust and optimism that Roose had long since concluded were luxuries that careful men could not afford. Catelyn Stark's presence added another layer of complexity to the situation. Her maternal devotion to her children and her fierce loyalty to her husband's memory made her both a more sympathetic figure than her son and a more dangerous one. Unlike Robb, whose youth and inexperience created blind spots that could be exploited, Catelyn possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of human nature that might allow her to recognize danger even when it wore the face of friendship. The wedding feast itself unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a well-constructed trap. The atmosphere was carefully calibrated to encourage relaxation and celebration while positioning key participants for maximum effect when the moment came. Musicians played traditional songs that would soon take on sinister significance. Wine flowed freely to dull reflexes and cloud judgment, and the apparent reconciliation between Stark and Frey created an illusion of security that would make the betrayal even more devastating. Roose's behavior during the feast reflected years of preparation for this moment. He maintained the perfect balance between celebration and vigilance, participating enough to avoid suspicion while positioning himself to act when the signal came. Every toast shared with Robb felt like another betrayal. Every smile exchanged with fellow Northern lords, another deception that would soon be exposed in the most brutal possible way. The signal, when it finally came, was as subtle as it was unmistakable. The musicians began playing The Rains of Castamere, the Lannister song that served as both a musical cue and a psychological weapon designed to maximize the terror of those about to die. In that moment, the careful facade that had been maintained for months finally fell away, revealing the true nature of what had been planned in secret chambers and hidden correspondence. Robb's realization of what was happening came too late to change anything but early enough to understand exactly who was responsible. The look he gave Roose in those final moments contained not just betrayal and anger, but a kind of disappointed understanding that was perhaps more painful than simple rage would have been. The young king who had trusted his bannerman completely was learning in the last moments of his life how naive that trust had been. Catelyn's desperate attempt to bargain for her son's life by threatening Walder Frey's grandson was both heartbreaking and futile, representing the kind of maternal devotion that transcended political calculation but could not overcome the momentum of events that had been set in motion months earlier. Her final act of defiance, slitting the boy's throat when her bargain was rejected, demonstrated the steel that had made her such a formidable figure throughout the war. The words Roose spoke as he drove the dagger into Robb's heart were carefully chosen for their psychological impact. Jaime Lannister sends his regards served multiple purposes, deflecting some responsibility while emphasizing the broader conspiracy that had made this moment possible. They were also the last words Robb Stark would ever hear, carrying with them the knowledge that his trust had been not just betrayed but calculated and planned from the very beginning. The massacre that followed was swift and thorough, designed to eliminate not just the primary targets, but all witnesses who might carry news of what had happened back to the north. The northern lords who had followed Rob in good faith died alongside their king, victims of political calculations that had reduced their lives to mere obstacles to be removed in service of larger strategic objectives. As the blood dried on the stones of the twins and servants began the grim work of disposing of bodies, Roose Bolton found himself transformed from bannerman to traitor, from loyal retainer to king-killer, from northern lord to southern ally. The man who had spent his entire life carefully building and maintaining his reputation had, in a single night, redefined himself completely through an act that would echo through history as one of the most shocking betrayals ever recorded. The dawn that followed the Red Wedding revealed a world fundamentally transformed, where the political landscape of the Seven Kingdoms had been redrawn in blood, and the ancient loyalties that had governed the North for thousands of years lay shattered beyond repair. Roose Bolton, standing amid the carnage he had helped orchestrate, understood that his gamble had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections. The rebellion that had threatened to tear the realm apart was effectively over, crushed not through prolonged siege or costly battle, but through a single night of calculated betrayal that would be remembered for generations. King Joffrey's decree, naming Roose as Warden of the North, arrived with gratifying speed, accompanied by promises of additional rewards and formal recognition of his pivotal role in ending the Northern Rebellion. The irony was not lost on Roose that the position he now held had been occupied by the Starks for centuries, and that his appointment represented not just a personal triumph, but the culmination of House Bolton's long struggle to escape the shadow of their ancient rivals. The practical challenges of transitioning from rebel bannerman to royal warden required careful management of both perception and reality. Roose needed to demonstrate to his new southern allies that he could deliver the stability and loyalty they expected, while simultaneously convincing the northern lords who remained that resistance would be both futile and ultimately self-destructive. This balancing act demanded all the political skills he had developed over decades of navigating treacherous waters. His decision to legitimize Ramsay as Ramsay Bolton, rather than continuing to acknowledge him as a bastard, was both reward for his son's contributions to their success and a practical necessity for ensuring the continuity of their house. With Domeric dead and no other true-born heirs, Ramsay represented the future of House Bolton regardless of his origins or character. The royal decree that transformed him from Snow to Bolton also served as a demonstration of Tywin Lannister's power to reshape the fundamental nature of identity itself. The integration of Ramsay into the new political order proved more challenging than Roose had anticipated. His son's reputation for exceptional cruelty, while useful during wartime, created complications in a pacified realm where stability and cooperation were more valuable than fear and intimidation. The stories emerging from Winterfell about Ramsay's treatment of Theon Greyjoy, while serving important political purposes in demonstrating the fate awaiting rebels, were also generating concerns among potential allies who questioned whether such extreme measures were necessary or wise. Fat Walder's pregnancy added another layer of complexity to the family dynamics that Roose needed to manage. The prospect of a legitimate heir created both opportunity and danger, providing insurance for the continuation of their line, while potentially threatening Ramsay's position as primary beneficiary of their recent success. Roose understood that his bastard son's jealousy and paranoia were likely to intensify as Walder's condition progressed, requiring careful management to prevent internal conflicts from undermining their external achievements. The journey from the Dreadfort to Winterfell represented more than a simple change of residence. It symbolized the complete transformation of House Bolton's status within the northern hierarchy. For centuries, the Boltons had been among the most powerful of the Stark bannermen, but always subordinate to the ancient kings of the north. Now, for the first time in recorded history, a Bolton would rule from Winterfell itself, governing the north not as a vassal but as the direct representative of the Iron Throne. Winterfell itself bore the scars of its recent occupation and siege, requiring substantial investments in repair and renovation before it could serve as an appropriate seat for the new Warden of the North. The Ironborn had left their mark through both deliberate destruction and simple neglect, while the subsequent siege had damaged walls and buildings that had stood for centuries. Roose approached these restoration projects with characteristic attention to detail, understanding that the appearance of strength and stability was almost as important as their reality. The fake Arya Stark arrangement represented perhaps the most audacious aspect of Tywin Lannister's post-war political strategy. By presenting Jane Poole as Arya Stark and arranging her marriage to Ramsay Bolton, the Crown achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. The union provided legitimacy for Bolton rule by connecting it to the Stark bloodline, offered closure for Northern lords who might otherwise continue hoping for Stark restoration, and created a hostage whose welfare could be used to influence any remaining Stark loyalists. Roose's role in facilitating this deception required him to balance multiple competing considerations. He needed to ensure that Ramsay understood the political importance of treating his bride with sufficient care to maintain the illusion of legitimacy, while also managing the practical reality that few people familiar with the real Arya Stark were likely to be fooled by the substitution. The success of the arrangement depended largely on the willingness of Northern lords to accept what they knew was likely a fiction rather than continue a resistance that offered no realistic hope of success. The political landscape of the pacified North required delicate navigation between former enemies who were now expected to cooperate in governance and administration. Many of the surviving northern houses harbored deep resentments about the Red Wedding and its aftermath, yet they also recognized that continued resistance would likely result in their complete destruction rather than any meaningful change in their circumstances. Roose needed to provide these reluctant allies with reasons to cooperate that went beyond simple fear of punishment. His approach to governing the North reflected lessons learned from years of careful observation of effective leadership styles. Where the Starks had ruled through personal loyalty and moral authority, Roose governed through a combination of practical incentives and calculated consequences that made cooperation more attractive than resistance. He offered former enemies opportunities to regain status and security through loyal service, while making it clear that betrayal would be met with responses that made the Red Wedding seem merciful by comparison. The integration of Southern political practices with Northern traditions created tensions that required constant attention to prevent them from escalating into open rebellion. The North had always been governed through personal relationships and ancient customs that emphasized honor and duty over legal technicalities and bureaucratic efficiency. Roose's challenge was to implement the kind of centralized control that his new position required while maintaining enough respect for traditional ways to avoid alienating the people he needed to govern effectively. The establishment of his court at Winterfell brought together an unlikely collection of allies, former enemies, and opportunists who represented the complex reality of post-war politics. Former Stark loyalists who had chosen submission over destruction worked alongside Bolton supporters who had risked everything on their lord's gamble, while Southern representatives ensured that the Crown's interests were properly represented and protected. Managing these competing factions required diplomatic skills that Roose had never needed during his years as a simple bannerman. The arrival of ravens from King's Landing carrying news of broader developments in the realm served as constant reminders that the North's pacification was only one element in a much larger political transformation. Tywin Lannister's death, when it came, would create new uncertainties and opportunities that would test every alliance and assumption that had governed the post-war settlement. Roose understood that his position as warden depended not just on his past service but on his continued usefulness to whatever power structure emerged from the ongoing struggles in the capital. The foundations of the new order were being laid with characteristic Bolton efficiency and attention to detail. But Roose was experienced enough to recognize that even the most carefully constructed political arrangements remained vulnerable to the kind of unexpected developments that had originally created his opportunity to rise above his ancient position as a mere bannerman. The transformation from fortress of rebellion to seat of royal authority required more than architectural repairs and administrative reorganization. Winterfell carried within its ancient walls the accumulated weight of 8,000 years of Stark rule, and every stone seemed to whisper reminders of the dynasty that had been so brutally severed. For Roose Bolton, establishing legitimate governance in such an environment demanded a delicate balance between respecting the castle's history and asserting his own authority as its new master. The servants and retainers who had survived the various sieges and occupations presented both opportunities and challenges for the new administration. Many possessed invaluable knowledge about the daily operations that kept Winterfell functioning, yet their loyalty to the displaced Stark family remained an undercurrent that could not be ignored or entirely suppressed. Roose addressed this tension through a combination of pragmatic incentives and subtle intimidation, making it clear that competent service would be rewarded while disloyalty would be punished with characteristic Bolton thoroughness. Among the most significant of these inherited retainers was Maester Luwin's replacement and the various craftsmen whose skills were essential to maintaining the castle's complex infrastructure. The Godswood, with its ancient heart tree and pool of black water, remained largely untouched despite its symbolic importance to the former ruling family. Roose understood that some traditions were too deeply rooted to challenge directly, and that tolerance for northern customs could actually strengthen his position by demonstrating respect for local sensibilities. The establishment of his daily routine within Winterfell's halls reflected Bruce's methodical approach to governance. Morning audiences allowed him to address petitions and disputes from across the north, providing visibility and accessibility that helped legitimize his authority while gathering intelligence about potential sources of unrest. These sessions also served as demonstrations of his commitment to justice and order, albeit a version of justice that incorporated Bolton perspectives on appropriate punishments for various offenses. Managing his relationship with Ramsay proved increasingly complex as his son adapted to his new status as heir to a great house rather than merely a legitimized bastard. The power and responsibility that came with their elevation seemed to amplify both Ramsay's capabilities and his excesses, creating a dynamic that required constant attention to prevent it from undermining their carefully constructed political position. Roose's famous counsel to his son, delivered during one of their private conferences, encapsulated his approach to this challenge with characteristic directness. "Don't make me rue the day I raped your mother," he told Ramsay. Words that carried layers of meaning, extending far beyond their surface brutality. The statement served simultaneously as a reminder of Ramsay's origins, a warning about the consequences of disappointing his father, and an assertion of Roose's ultimate authority within their family hierarchy. It was the kind of communication that Roose excelled at, conveying complex messages through seemingly simple declarations that left no room for misinterpretation. The arrival of the girl who would be presented as Arya Stark marked another crucial phase in the consolidation of Bolton power. Jane Poole, transformed through months of preparation and coaching into a convincing facsimile of the missing Stark daughter, represented both the culmination of Tywin Lannister's political strategy and a significant test of Roose's ability to manage the competing demands of his various allies and subjects. The deception required careful orchestration involving multiple levels of complicity and willful blindness. Northern lords, who almost certainly recognized the substitution, were expected to participate in the fiction for the sake of political stability, while servants and small folk who might remember the real Arya needed to be managed through a combination of distance and intimidation. The success of such an elaborate performance depended on everyone involved understanding their roles and the consequences of failing to play them convincingly. Preparations for the wedding between Ramsay and the false Arya consumed weeks of planning and negotiation as Roose worked to balance the symbolic importance of the ceremony with practical concerns about security and political messaging. The event needed to demonstrate Bolton legitimacy and northern acceptance while avoiding provocations that might inspire renewed resistance among die-hard Stark loyalists. Every detail, from the guest list to the menu, required careful consideration of its potential political implications. The ceremony itself unfolded with the carefully orchestrated pageantry that such occasions demanded. Yet underneath the celebration lay currents of tension that reflected the complex emotions surrounding the event. For many attendees, the wedding represented either the final acceptance of Stark defeat or a necessary accommodation with new realities, while for others, it offered opportunities to demonstrate loyalty to the new regime or at least avoid suspicion of continued resistance. Roose's observations of his son's behavior during these proceedings reinforced his growing concerns about Ramsay's ability to distinguish between necessary political theater and personal gratification. The marriage was intended to serve specific strategic purposes, yet Roose recognized that his son viewed it primarily as an opportunity to indulge appetites that had little connection to their family's broader interests. This disconnect between political necessity and personal desire represented a vulnerability that could potentially undermine everything they had achieved. The integration of their new daughter-in-law into the household dynamic created additional complexities that required sensitive management. The girl's traumatic experiences had left her fragile and unpredictable, yet her cooperation was essential for maintaining the fiction that legitimized their rule. Roose found himself in the unusual position of needing to protect someone from his own son's excesses, while simultaneously ensuring that she fulfilled her role in their political arrangements. Meanwhile, the broader administration of the North required constant attention to prevent the kind of deterioration that could invite intervention from King's Landing or provide opportunities for rebellious elements to regain influence. Tax collection, law enforcement, military readiness, and diplomatic relations with neighboring regions all demanded oversight that reflected both competence and loyalty to the crown. Roose approached these responsibilities with the same methodical efficiency he had always brought to administrative tasks, understanding that successful governance was ultimately about managing countless small details rather than making dramatic gestures. Communication with other northern houses remained a delicate balance between authority and diplomacy, as Roose worked to transform former enemies into cooperative vassals while maintaining the support of traditional allies who might question some of his methods. Houses like Manderley and Umber, whose loyalty to the Starks had been legendary, presented particular challenges that required subtle approaches rather than direct confrontation. The goal was to create a new equilibrium based on mutual interest rather than ancient obligation, but achieving this objective required patience and skill that tested even Roose's considerable political abilities. The changing seasons brought their own rhythms and challenges to the administration of Winterfell, as the approaching winter created pressures that had historically tested every northern ruler, ensuring adequate food supplies, maintaining defenses against both human and natural threats, and managing the social tensions that arose when communities were confined together for extended periods, all required proactive planning and flexible responses to unexpected developments. Reports from across the realm continued to arrive through various channels, providing intelligence about developments that could affect the North's stability and the Bolton family's security. Stannis Baratheon's activities at the Wall, political maneuvering in King's Landing, and stirrings among various potential claimants all represented variables that could reshape the political landscape with little warning. Roose understood that his position, while secure for the moment, remained dependent on maintaining the confidence of allies whose priorities might shift based on changing circumstances. The intelligence that reached Winterfell during the depths of winter carried news that would test every assumption Roose Bolton had made about the stability of his new position. Stannis Baratheon, the brother of the dead king and claimant to the Iron Throne, had established himself at Castle Black and was gathering strength among the wildlings and northern mountain clans. What had initially appeared to be a minor irritation was developing into a genuine threat that could destabilize everything Roose had worked to achieve since the Red Wedding. The political implications of Stannis's presence in the north were far more dangerous than his immediate military capabilities might suggest. The rightful king, as many still considered him, possessed a legitimacy that no amount of royal pardons or political maneuvering could completely overcome. His reputation for unwavering justice and moral rectitude, while often inconvenient during peacetime, became powerful weapons when wielded against lords whose rise to power had been built on betrayal and opportunism. More troubling still were the reports filtering in from various sources about the composition of Stannis's growing army. The mountain clans, traditional enemies of House Bolton, were rallying to his banners with an enthusiasm that spoke to deep-seated grievances extending far beyond simple political preferences. These hardy fighters knew the northern terrain intimately and harbored ancestral hatreds that made them particularly dangerous opponents for any Bolton force that might be sent against them. The ravens carrying news from Castle Black also brought disturbing information about supernatural threats that most lords would have dismissed as superstition and folklore. Reports of the dead rising beyond the wall, of ancient enemies stirring in the frozen wastes, of magic returning to a world that had forgotten such things. While Roose maintained his characteristic skepticism about extraordinary claims, he was also practical enough to recognize that even false beliefs could become real threats if they inspired enough people to act upon them. Within the walls of Winterfell itself, a different kind of threat was developing with equally dangerous implications for House Bolton's future. Fat Walder's pregnancy had progressed smoothly through the winter months, and the approaching birth of what would likely be a male heir created tensions that required careful management to prevent them from exploding into open conflict. Roose had anticipated this development and planned for it, yet the reality proved more complex than his preparations had accounted for. Ramsay's reaction to the prospect of a potential rival for his inheritance revealed aspects of his character that concerned even his pragmatic father. The paranoia and jealousy that had always been part of his son's nature were intensifying under the pressure of uncertainty about his future position. What had once been manageable character flaws were evolving into genuine threats to family stability and political security. The birth itself, when it finally came, brought both joy and apprehension to the Lord of Winterfell. The healthy boy who emerged from Fat Walder's labors represented hope for the continuation of House Bolton's newfound prominence, yet Roose was experienced enough to recognize that the child's arrival had fundamentally altered the dynamics within his household. Ramsay's status as heir presumptive had been replaced by a more precarious position that depended entirely on his father's continued favor and his brother's potential mortality. Roose's attempts to manage the growing tension between his legitimate son and his legitimized bastard required diplomatic skills that he had never needed to employ within his own family. The delicate balance between reassuring Ramsay about his continued importance while protecting the infant who represented their dynasty's future demanded constant attention and increasingly creative solutions. Every interaction between the brothers, however brief or seemingly innocent, carried the potential for violence that could destroy everything. The preparation of Winterfell's defenses against Stannis's approaching army provided both distraction from these internal tensions and opportunities to demonstrate competence that might reassure doubters about Bolton leadership capabilities. The ancient fortress possessed advantages that any defender could exploit, from its massive walls to its strategic position commanding the surrounding countryside. Yet Roose understood that defensive preparations alone would not be sufficient to resolve the crisis that was developing. The loyalty of his own forces became another source of concern as reports arrived about Stannis's growing strength and the enthusiasm with which some northern houses were answering his call. Soldiers who had fought bravely for House Bolton during the rebellion might find themselves questioning whether their allegiance should transfer to a king whose claim seemed more legitimate than the authority they currently served. Managing these doubts required a combination of incentives, threats, and appeals to personal loyalty that tested Roose's leadership abilities. Intelligence gathering became increasingly important as the military situation developed. Yet the networks that had served him so well during the war were less reliable in the current circumstances. Many of his former sources had been compromised by changing political loyalties, while new information came filtered through channels that might have their own agendas and motivations. The fog of approaching conflict made it difficult to distinguish between reliable intelligence and deliberate misinformation. The diplomatic options available to Roose were limited by the nature of the conflict and the personalities involved. Stannis Baratheon was not the kind of man who could be bought, threatened, or negotiated with through conventional means. His rigid moral code made compromise unlikely, while his military situation made him desperate enough to take risks that more cautious commanders might avoid. Any resolution would likely require military action rather than political maneuvering. Within Winterfell's halls, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense as various factions prepared for the conflict that seemed inevitable. Servants whispered about omens and portents, while soldiers checked their weapons and armor with the careful attention of men who expected to use them soon. The normal routines of castle life continued, yet everyone understood that fundamental changes were approaching that would determine the fate of everyone within the walls. Roose found himself reflecting more frequently on the decisions that had brought him to this moment, examining the chain of choices that had elevated House Bolton to unprecedented heights while creating vulnerabilities that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The gamble that had begun with secret communications to Tywin Lannister was approaching another crucial decision point, one that would test whether his political skills were sufficient to navigate the crisis that was developing. The management of information flow became increasingly critical as rumors and speculation threatened to undermine morale and discipline among his forces. Stories about Stannis's capabilities were often exaggerated, yet suppressing them entirely risked creating the impression that leadership was either ignorant of the threat or unwilling to acknowledge its seriousness. Finding the right balance between honest assessment and confidence building required constant adjustment based on changing circumstances. The approach of winter added another layer of complexity to the strategic calculations that governed preparation for the coming conflict. Weather conditions that made military operations more difficult also created opportunities for creative tactics that might offset numerical disadvantages. The harsh northern climate was as much an enemy as any human opponent, yet it was also a potential ally for defenders who understood how to exploit its effects on attacking forces. As reports continued to arrive about Stannis's movements and the growing size of his army, Roose began to understand that the comfortable period following his victory at the Red Wedding was ending. The new phase of conflict that was approaching would test everything he had learned about survival and adaptation, requiring him to demonstrate once again that House Bolton possessed the flexibility and ruthlessness necessary to thrive in a world where political fortunes could change as quickly as northern weather. The raven that arrived at Winterfell, bearing news of Stannis Baratheon's defeat, carried information that should have brought relief and celebration to the Bolton household. The Pretender King's army had been shattered in the snows outside the castle walls, his mercenaries and sellswords scattered to the winds, and his threat to the New Order eliminated without the need for a costly siege. For most lords, such news would have represented validation of their strategic decisions and confirmation of their political wisdom. For Roose Bolton, however, the moment of triumph carried with it an awareness that victories often created new dangers as surely as they eliminated old ones. The details of Stannis's defeat, as they emerged through various sources and reports, revealed both the effectiveness of Bolton military preparations and the role that northern weather had played in determining the outcome. The Pretender's forces, many of them Southerners unaccustomed to the brutal realities of winter warfare, had suffered devastating casualties before any battle could be properly joined. Frostbite, starvation, and desertion had accomplished what sword and spear might have achieved only at tremendous cost to the defenders. Yet even as Roose absorbed the satisfaction of seeing his strategic calculations vindicated, he remained alert to the broader implications of these developments. Stannis' defeat eliminated one threat but did not resolve the fundamental challenges facing his position as Warden of the North. The legitimacy questions that had been temporarily overshadowed by immediate military concerns would inevitably resurface, while new complications continued to emerge from sources that seemed to multiply faster than they could be addressed. Within Winterfell itself, the aftermath of victory created an atmosphere of celebration that masked undercurrents of tension that had been building throughout the crisis. Ramsay's behavior during the siege had demonstrated both his military capabilities and his increasing independence from paternal guidance, creating a dynamic that concerned Roose even as he recognized its potential value. His son's effectiveness as a commander was undeniable, yet the methods he employed and the pleasure he seemed to derive from violence suggested appetites that could become problematic if not properly managed. The presence of Fat Walder and their infant son added another layer of complexity to the family dynamics that were evolving in response to changing circumstances. Ramsay's jealousy regarding his potential displacement as heir had been temporarily suppressed by the demands of military preparation and combat, yet the successful resolution of the external threat meant that internal tensions could no longer be ignored or postponed through appeals to shared necessity. Roose's assessment of his son's psychological state during the days following Stannis' defeat revealed troubling patterns that suggested more serious problems than simple sibling rivalry or inheritance anxiety. The combination of paranoia, cruelty, and impulsiveness that had always characterized Ramsay's personality seemed to be intensifying under the pressure of uncertainty about his future position. What had once been manageable character flaws were evolving into genuine threats to family stability and political security. The decision that Ramsay reached regarding his perceived rivals was both logical from his perspective and devastating in its implications for House Bolton's future. The infant who represented potential competition for his inheritance was not merely an abstract threat, but a concrete obstacle that could be eliminated through direct action. Similarly, Fat Walder's continued presence served as a reminder of his own questionable legitimacy and his father's capacity to produce more conventional heirs. The murders, when they occurred, demonstrated a calculating ruthlessness that exceeded even Roose's expectations of his son's capabilities. The elimination of Fat Walder and her baby was accomplished with an efficiency that spoke to careful planning rather than impulsive violence, suggesting that Ramsay had been contemplating this solution for some time before acting upon it. The method chosen was brutal enough to send a clear message about the consequences of threatening his position while being deniable enough to avoid immediate retaliation. Roose's discovery of what had happened created a moment of recognition that transcended simple grief or anger. The man who had spent his entire adult life calculating risks and managing threats found himself confronting the reality that his most dangerous enemy had been living under his own roof, sharing his meals and his confidences, while planning the destruction of everything he held dear. The irony was not lost on him that the master of betrayal had been betrayed by his own blood. The confrontation between father and son that followed this revelation was inevitable, yet its outcome was determined by factors that Roose had failed to adequately consider in his assessment of the relationship's dynamics. His assumption that paternal authority and superior experience would provide sufficient protection proved fatally flawed when measured against Ramsay's desperation and willingness to commit acts that even Roose found shocking in their audacity. The conversation that preceded the final act was brief, yet it encompassed years of accumulated tension and mutual suspicion that had been building beneath the surface of their family relationship. Roose's attempt to assert control through the combination of reason and intimidation that had served him so well throughout his life encountered a mind that operated according to different principles and priorities than his own careful calculations had anticipated. Ramsay's declaration that he was now Lord of Winterfell was delivered with a conviction that reflected not just ambition but genuine belief in his right to claim that position through any means necessary. The words carried with them the weight of accumulated resentments and frustrated desires that had been shaped by years of uncertain status and conditional acceptance. In eliminating his father, he was not just removing an obstacle but claiming an identity that had been withheld from him despite his contributions to their shared success. The physical act of murder itself was swift and decisive, accomplished with the same efficiency that Ramsay had brought to the elimination of his other rivals. The blade that ended Roose Bolton's life was wielded by hands that showed no tremor of hesitation or regret, driven by a will that had moved beyond the constraints of family loyalty or moral consideration. The man who had taught his son that survival required the willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone had become the final sacrifice to his own philosophy. In his final moments, Roose experienced a clarity that had eluded him during years of careful planning and political maneuvering, the recognition that his life's work would die with him, that the dynasty he had sacrificed everything to establish would be consumed by the same ruthless ambition that had created it, brought with it an understanding of the fundamental futility of his approach to power and survival. The game he had played so skillfully had ultimately claimed not just his enemies but himself. The silence that followed Ramsay's patricide was filled with implications that would reshape the political landscape of the North and determine the fate of everyone who had become entangled in the Bolton family's rise to power. The careful balance that Roose had maintained between competing factions and conflicting loyalties had been destroyed in a moment of violence that revealed the inherent instability of any system built on betrayal and fear rather than legitimate authority and willing cooperation. The new Lord Bolton, who emerged from that confrontation, was a different creature than the son who had entered it, transformed by the act of ultimate rebellion into something that transcended the categories his father had used to understand human nature and political behavior. The destruction of the old order was complete, yet what would emerge from its ashes remained to be determined by forces that had been unleashed but not controlled by the careful calculations that had brought House Bolton to its moment of greatest triumph and ultimate destruction. The legacy of Roose Bolton would be measured not by the heights he had achieved, but by the depths to which his methods had led, a cautionary tale about the price of survival purchased through the systematic betrayal of every principle and relationship that might have provided stability and meaning. In teaching his son that power was the only value worth pursuing, he had created the instrument of his own destruction and ensured that his dynasty would be remembered for its cruelty rather than its competence. In the quiet moments that follow great upheavals, when the immediate noise of conflict has faded and the dust of ambition has settled, there comes a space for reflection on the true nature of what has passed. The story of Roose Bolton, the Leech Lord who whispered his way to power only to be silenced by his own creation, offers lessons that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of his rise and fall. His tale speaks to fundamental truths about power, family, and the price of survival in a world where moral compromises become the foundation upon which entire dynasties are built and destroyed. The North remembers, as it always has, and always will. In the years that followed the extinction of House Bolton, the stories told around winter fires would speak of the quiet lord who played the great game with such skill that he forgot the most basic rule of all: those who live by betrayal must eventually face betrayal in return. The flayed man banners that had flown over the Dreadfort for 1,000 years would be taken down and burned, their ashes scattered to winter winds that carry no loyalty to any house or cause. Yet there was something almost poetic in the way Roose Bolton's life concluded, a symmetry that speaks to the deeper patterns governing the rise and fall of great houses in Westeros. The man who had built his power through the careful manipulation of family bonds was ultimately destroyed by the very relationship he had worked hardest to control. The son he had shaped and molded according to his own understanding of survival and strength became the instrument through which all his calculations were rendered meaningless in a single moment of violence. The irony, was not lost on those who understood the fuller scope of his story. Roose had spent decades preparing for every possible threat, analyzing every potential enemy, and positioning himself to survive whatever chaos might emerge from the conflicts that periodically swept across the Seven Kingdoms. Yet his most dangerous enemy had shared his name, his blood, and his table, learning from his example, while harboring ambitions that exceeded even his father's ruthless pragmatism. In the great wheel of seasons that governs life in the north, winter eventually gives way to spring, and the harsh lessons of survival are softened by the promise of renewal and growth. The castle of Winterfell, which had witnessed so much suffering under Bolton rule, would eventually know peace again. The servants who had endured the terror of those years would find new purpose in service to worthier masters. The small folk who had cowered beneath the shadow of the flayed man would learn to walk with dignity once more. The Godswood at Winterfell, with its ancient heart tree and pool of black water, remained unchanged by the human dramas that played out beneath its branches. The old gods, if they existed at all, showed no preference for any particular house or dynasty. They had watched the rise of House Stark from obscurity to kingship, witnessed their fall to treachery and ambition, and would undoubtedly observe their eventual return with the same patient indifference they showed to all mortal concerns. Perhaps that is the most comforting lesson to be drawn from the story of Roose Bolton and his brief, violent dynasty. In the vast sweep of history, even the most carefully laid plans and ruthless calculations become mere footnotes to larger patterns that extend far beyond individual ambition or family legacy. The North that had existed for thousands of years before the Boltons rose to prominence would continue long after their banners had been forgotten and their deeds reduced to cautionary tales told to remind future generations about the dangers of unchecked ambition. The snow that falls on empty battlefields makes no distinction between the graves of heroes and villains. Time smooths all wounds and renders all victories temporary. The icy winds that howl through the halls of abandoned castles carry away the echoes of both triumph and defeat, leaving only silence and the promise that spring will come again, as it always has and always will. In this understanding, there is a kind of peace that transcends the immediate concerns of politics and power. The Game of Thrones continues to be played by new participants who believe they have learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, yet the fundamental patterns remain unchanged. Ambition drives men to reach for power they cannot ultimately control. Family bonds are tested by pressures they cannot always withstand, and the wheel of fortune continues its eternal turning, elevating some while crushing others beneath its inexorable weight. As you settle into the quiet comfort of your own evening, far removed from the harsh realities of medieval politics and dynastic struggle, let the story of Roose Bolton serve as a gentle reminder of the value of the simple certainties that govern your own life. The warmth of family bonds built on love rather than calculation. The security of friendships based on mutual respect rather than mutual advantage. The peace that comes from knowing that your legacy will be measured not by the heights you achieved through ruthless ambition, but by the kindness you showed to those who needed it, and the love you shared with those who mattered most. Let these thoughts carry you gently towards sleep, secure in the knowledge that morning will bring new possibilities for grace, connection, and the quiet satisfactions that make life meaningful beyond the reach of any crown or castle.